as orchestrators, a large part of our job is taking themes or motifs or melodies and developing them. And there are various ways of doing this. And I want to spend the next couple of videos looking at different strategies for motivic development. Now, I've done some of this throughout the videos where I've added embellishments and ornamentations and repeated some notes and made some notes longer, some notes shorter. These are all techniques, but I want to kind of take a methodical look at them. So here's our central theme. It should be pretty familiar to you by now. So one technique is an exact repetition of the motif. So here, I'm taking that first phrase, which sounds like this, and repeating it again. So over here, I'm going to go, and then, I'm going to repeat it here again. So I'm just taking selected fragments of it and repeating it, and that's a way of stretching and elongating and developing the theme. So that's an interesting, simple, and direct way to develop a theme. Now, I'm going to just play this without the melody. I want to show you what I've done in the orchestration. I've got a little bit of a busy accompaniment going on. We've got violins and flutes doubling this rhythmic pattern. An ostinato type of pattern on the strings, and then some sustained chords on the trombones, and a little bit of percussion. And I'm just alternating between the A minor and E minor. I'm not doing anything fancy harmonically here. So once again, with this idea of repeating selected motifs in this theme. Repetition. Now, another technique is to do what's called sequential repetition, where we repeat the motif, but on different degrees of the scale. So in this example, I'm just going to play you this part solo, the trumpets. So I'm taking that 3-note motif and starting it on the next scale degree and then the next one. And then the motif going down, I'm again going diatonically down the scale. Same thing. So I'm not doing it to the entire melody, but just to selected little phrases within it. So let's listen to this example now with some accompaniment. So again, let's take a look at what's going on in the accompaniment here. I've got the glockenspiel doubling the trumpets for the melody. So let me just mute those for a moment and we'll listen to the rest on the flutes also. So I've got some more interesting harmonic movement here. As we're moving up the scale, it opens up the possibility for different chord substitutions. So it can be a lot more interesting. So again, thematic development here by modifying the melody by sequential repetition, which also opens up the possibility of some harmonic substitutions. Now, let's look at another technique, which is retrograde, playing the melody backwards, inverting it. So again, in this example, take a look. I have it on clarinets and trombones. I'll just solo this for the moment. So instead of going, I'm doing it backwards. So normally I'd go, but now I'm doing it backwards. So these are all the same notes in my melody, more or less in the same order, but I'm inverting them or playing them backwards in retrograde. So let's listen to this little arrangement. So again, without the melody, just to listen to the accompaniment for a moment. So again, I've got the different sections doing different elements of the accompaniment here. Some long notes on the bass, that's a key switch note. Cello doing this type of pattern. And again, these are just key switch notes that I haven't filtered out of the score display. Doing this. And then the violins. Doing more, again, key switch note up here, but doing more of the sustained underlying harmonic notes. Little bit of percussion and then the melody added in, and let's listen to it all together one last time. So those are three simple techniques for motivic development, and these are powerful tools to fall back on if you're trying to come up with ideas or interesting ways or places to take the orchestration and the arrangement. These will open up a lot of doors for you. So manipulating melodic motifs is one of the tools that we use to build up themes and variations. We can use exact repetition, which involves literal repeating of parts of the phrase. And then we can use sequential repetition, which involves repeating the motifs on different degrees of the scale, often but not always ascending or descending diatonically. And then retrograde involves playing phrases backwards and inverting either the intervals or the rhythms or both. And we'll look at more of these techniques in the next video. We're going to continue looking at techniques for developing motifs and melodies. So once again, here's our melody. So first up is what's called intervallic contraction. Now that's a fancy way of saying that we change the intervals between some of the notes by making them smaller. So for example, the first few notes go like this. Well, maybe we could go a half tone like that. And then, so maybe we can go, or, so it's the same shape and direction, but we're making the intervals smaller. And in this case, they're mainly steps, so we can go to half steps. But when we're jumping with bigger intervals, like we can go up just one tone or even a half tone. And let's look at what I've done here. So I'm starting off with English horn, and here, that chromaticism that I just demonstrated. And then chromaticism there. Again, going down chromatically. And then here up just a step instead of the minor third. So smaller intervals. So let's listen to what's going on. And I'm going to start by just playing you the accompaniment. Just there's a lot to focus on. Here I have the English horn, clarinets, and piccolo playing the melody. But here's the accompaniment for now without that. So you can hear that I've altered the harmony to fit my new melodies. So I'm basically staying around A minor, and then I'm going up to F at one point. But here it is with this contracted melody. So very different from our original melody, and as orchestrators for developing motivic variations, this is a nice kind of departure point. Let me play it for you one more time. Now, the next variation is intervallic expansion. Some of these are named wrong, but basically intervallic expansion, where we make the intervals larger than they originally are rather than smaller. So I have it here on piccolo, viola, and cello. So let's look at this piccolo version to start with. And instead of going like this, I'm going. And then the melody would naturally go. Here I'm going. So larger intervals. Let me just play you this melody, and I'll just solo it with the three instruments that are layering it. Again, a larger jump. Large jump. So bigger intervals than the original melody. And let's just listen to the accompaniment to start with, just so again we can focus on what's going on. And here it is. So here I'm uncharacteristically using the oboe as a staccato type of accompaniment, doubled with trumpets. And now let's hear it with this expanded melody. So again, all of these melodic alterations offer new harmonic possibilities. Now, the third variation is ornamentation, and I've touched on this again earlier in this series, but the idea is that we add to the melody by introducing neighboring tones and just augmenting it with additional notes. So again, here I have it doubled in a few different places, but let's look at it in the oboe here. And instead of going like this, I'm adding extra notes. So I'm doing these two notes leading up to the first. And then to get to the C over here, I'm doing some ornamentation. I'm doing that using neighboring tones, the scale tone above and the scale tone below. So normally then I'd go. So here I'm going, putting the neighbor toning before that G. And then, so normally I'd go. So here I'm adding in the neighboring tone above. And then to get to that E, I'm going like this. So neighboring tone above and a skip below by jumping down an interval. So it doesn't have to be scale-wise. But the idea is that I'm adding to the melody by adding scale tones or chord tones above and below the principal notes. So let's listen to what's going on here. I have it on oboe and on bass clarinet and on trumpets, and I'm going to play just the accompaniment to start with. and on Glock. So let me play it now with the melody, with the ornamentation, with glockenspiel, as well as oboe, bass clarinets, and trumpets. So again, thematic variations by adding ornamentation, a very different feel and shape and contour to the melody, and again, potentially different harmonies. We're going to continue looking at some useful and fun and stimulating theme and variation techniques in this video. So once again, here's our main theme. Now, the first technique I want to look at in this video is rhythmic augmentation, where we actually change the rhythm and make the notes longer. So, for example, instead of going 2/8 notes to a half note, I'm going 2/4 notes to a whole note. So here I've got this playing on flutes, trumpets, and cello, and let's listen to what that sounds like. I'll just play it with a click so you can hear what I'm doing. So there's our theme, but stretched out. So now this becomes 2 bars. So you get the idea. So let's start by just listening to the accompaniment first, because of course, again, this opens up the door to all kinds of interesting changes in how we're going to orchestrate this. I have this little counter line going on with the second violins and clarinet, French horn playing some divisi parts, and trombone playing some sustained notes. So again, let's just listen to this little counter line. Bringing in French horn and trombones, and a little bit of snare and bass drum. So let's listen to it all together with this elongated melody, and you're going to hear how it has a completely different kind of feel to it. So very stimulating doing this kind of thing. Now, the opposite of that is rhythmic diminution, where we're going to speed up the rhythm of the melody and make it quicker. So, for example, here it is on piccolo. These are all the same tempo. I'm just playing with the rhythmic spacing of the music. So again, here I have this doubled on piccolo, bassoons, and trumpets and xylophone. And let me just mute those for a moment and we'll listen to the accompaniment. And again, you can go in different directions, but this is what I've chosen to do. And you can see here in the violins, I've got some staccato notes, and I've got the right articulations for this so I get a nice staccato sound. Interesting counter cello part. And with the bass. So let's listen to everything together now with this sped up melody. And doubled on xylophone as well. Now, I could have gone in another direction and done much more legato accompaniment and had this faster, but that's one way that I chose to go. Now, the next thing that we can do is fragmentation. And that's a technique where we take little elements or cells of the melody and just play them on their own. We don't necessarily need to play the whole melody in the whole order. For example, here's the flute doing it. And let me just solo this. This is our first note. So I'm just playing little fragments of it, and I'm transposing it onto different scale degrees there. I want to look at some DAW production kind of tips and workflows that are applicable to all DAWs. I'm working in Logic Pro, but these same features are found in all the major DAWs. Now, I want to look at one of the examples from the last video, and we're going to look at this trombone section part that's playing sustained chords. The first thing is, don't quantize. When you're doing this kind of orchestral music, you don't want everything on the grid. Now, for example, here's the first chord, and you can see they all start on slightly different ticks. And same thing here, and that's because I played them freely and didn't quantize. Some are a bit late, some are a bit early. Some of it has to do with the envelope of the attack of the note, but that's fine. We can compensate for that if we need to. I'll get to that in a moment. But for now, don't quantize, play in your parts like that. And if we look here, you'll see some are starting a little early, some are a little late, and that's all okay. It works in the whole context. Let me play you this part just to remind you what it sounds like, and I'm muting the melody just so we're not distracted by it, and we can focus on this for now. Now, the next thing I want to point out, and this is a general DAW workflow tip, when you're working with key switches, I've mentioned this earlier, make sure that your key switch starts before the actual note event. But the other thing is, if in an example like this, where I have a long phrase that's all using the same key switch, stretch out your key switch note so it goes till the end or close till the end. And the reason for that is, let's say I have later down the line another region with another key switch and I'm playing back there and doing some work. And then I come and I want to start playback from here. I need it to chase this key switch. I need to make sure it's going to grab this key switch and remember it. And the way to do that is to extend this, and also in your DAW, make sure to enable the chase notes function. You want it to chase sustained notes so that it's going to look back and grab this key switch. So useful to have that on. Now, when you're recording a part like this with 3 or however many notes for the ensemble section, in this case, trombones, this is what we call divisi, where you're breaking up the section and they're each playing separate notes rather than them all playing the same notes. Now, if your library that you're using has this, it's best to use alternate samples so that they're not all the exact same instrument. Now, here in this library, I'm using trombone ensemble large, but if I go into my brass section, I'll see I have trombone 1, trombone 2, and trombone 3. So I'm going to duplicate this. Let me just duplicate this 3 times. I want to leave the original intact. And now on the first one, I'm going to rename this trombone 1. And I'm going to call up here the trombone 1 instrument and replace it. You'll see I have the same thing for trumpets, 3 trumpets. So that's replaced, and I'm going to quickly do the same thing with the others. So now with that done, I'm going to close this up. I'm going to take our main trombone part and I'm just going to mute it and I'm going to leave it intact. I'm going to copy this down to each of the successive trombone section parts. And I'm going to go in here. And again, all DAWs have similar functions. I'm going to use the key command Shift with the up arrow to select the top note. And then I'm going to go Shift I to invert the selection so I have everything except the top note. And I'm going to delete that. And now I can rename this one top voice. And now I'm going to select the next one where I want to get the middle voice. I'm going to go Shift up arrow, delete. And now I want the middle one. I can go Shift bottom arrow to select the lowest note, but I don't want that because that's going to select my key switch note. So I think what I'm going to do is just delete these manually in this case. And if it's not too long apart, that shouldn't take too long. So now I can rename this one. And let's go to the third one here where I want the bottom voice. Again, Shift up arrow, delete, Shift up arrow, delete. Now I'm left with my key switch note and the lowest voice, and I'll rename that one. Now, because these have the key switch notes, they should sound pretty much the same, although split between the different trombones. And I can pan them uniquely if I want. I'll leave that one in the middle. And by having these split up, I can now double them. Maybe I want that top voice doubled on something in the woodwind section. Maybe the clarinets, they're being used here for something else, but maybe the French horns. And this is another great example of being able to separate the three voices and then double them if you want a denser layer with the top, middle, and low voice on three separate French horns rather than just playing the chord. And as always, let's not forget about either drawing in or playing in some expression and controller data for vibrato and whatever other parameters you have. So for example, I could go to expression here and on these swells, maybe draw in some points to get them coming up and down. Here I've played in modulation and expression on each of the three trombone parts, and I copied those parts to three separate French horns and drawn in some modulation or played in modulation and expression there as well. And I've got some unique panning, and I can adjust levels, of course, as I want to balance out the voices and get different parts coming out in different areas of the spectrum. And here's what I've got. So I've got nice control over those swells on the long notes where I have the modulation fading out, but the expression going up, and it sounds great in context. And let's listen with the other parts that were muted. So if you're creating divisi parts where the same instrument section is playing multiple notes, try and use different sample sets if you have access to them. And record in any real-time performance controls separately for each part so you get some natural variations between the instruments. Now, another way to help the music breathe and have more feeling to it is to use some tempo fluctuations. With this type of orchestral arranging, there's often little dips and swells in the speed to communicate the pacing and feeling of the music. And we can easily program in retardandos and accelerandos. They can be subtle or they can be dramatic. Let me play you this clip once again as it is. It's at 118 beats per minute. And then I'm going to play you another version with some tempo changes in it to create more of a ebb and flow to the timing. All right, that sounds all well and good. I've created an alternate tempo set, and again, every DAW has this kind of functionality where we're starting at the same tempo. I'm getting a little bit brighter and then dipping back down, and then a nice little dip to a little bit of a pause, then back up a bit faster, and then a real dramatic downturn at the end to have a dramatic finale to it. So don't forget about tempo changes, subtle or not so subtle, to add to the emotion and pacing of your music. Now, I haven't spoken in this series much about placement of instruments in terms of the stereo spectrum and front to back, and there's two reasons for that, which I'll get to in a moment. But the first thing I want to draw your attention to in terms of DAW production techniques, if you want to create the illusion of something being a bit farther in back, there's naturally more latency and more of a delay as a listener when we're listening to orchestral music. When we listen for something like the percussion, which are in the back section of the orchestra setup, it takes longer for the sound to reach our ears, and there's a bit more of a delay. So one thing you can do to simulate that is use a delay parameter. Now, we're playing in parts unquantized already, but introduce a bit of a delay to have it be a bit later. And again, all DAWs have this facility. Here in Logic Pro, we have a delay feature where I can set a number of ticks for how late I want this to be. We can also do it on a track basis for every region on the track, but for now I'm just doing it for this. So for example, for this snare and bass drum, by moving it a bit later like this, we'll hear a bit more behind the beat as if it's a bit farther away. So you can, of course, introduce as much delay as you want. And you can also use this to compensate for slow attack times. If you have, for example, string samples that maybe have a slow attack, you can use a negative delay to get them to come in a bit earlier so that they ramp up and the main part of the attack happens closer to the beat. And that's for negative delays to get them earlier, where positive delays will push something later. Now, in terms of mixing orchestral music, I've stayed away from it for two reasons. One, we're talking about MIDI orchestration here, and we don't have to emulate the real-world spacing and placement of orchestral instruments. Now, if you are going for realism, here's a rough idea of where instruments are placed, and you can achieve this by panning. For example, violins 1 left, violins 2 not quite as left, cellos, flutes, oboes, basses, bassoons, clarinets, French horns, all the instruments we've spoken about in the percussion are in back, and so on. And you can emulate the front to back by using early reflections in your reverb. So, for example, you might put all of your violins assigned to one reverb and assign a certain amount of early reflections since they're all approximately the same distance away from the conductor or the listener, and then use different amounts of reverb sends. You can use another reverb maybe for flutes and oboes with different pre-delay, maybe another one for clarinets and bassoons, another one for the brass instruments, and another one for percussion. And the early reflections can enhance the listener's experience of the size of the space and the distance from the instruments. But as MIDI orchestrators, we of course have access to all kinds of instruments, synth sounds, and any other found sounds we might want to include in our orchestrations, which don't conform to this conventional setup. So again, rules are made to be broken, but these are the traditional placements. Now, the second reason I haven't spent too much time on it is because my colleague Gary Hebner at Groove 3 has a 4-hour and 47-minute series dedicated to mixing orchestral instruments, and he goes through in detail all of the instruments and all the sections and the best procedures and workflows for mixing them. So you might want to check that out. Now, another thing I want to mention, in terms of key switching, I've been working with traditional key switches, but many DAWs have their own proprietary systems that are more elegant than actually drawing in notes in your sequences. For example, in Logic Pro, we have articulation IDs where we can create our own articulation sets and use articulation IDs on notes to have them switch automatically. And Cubase has expression maps. Now, if you want to learn more about this, you can check out my series Logic Pro 10.4 Update Explained, where I go into detail here in terms of working with the articulation IDs, the articulation set editor, and articulation switching with third-party instruments. And my colleague Gary Hebner has a series on Cubase 10 editing MIDI, where he goes into details on using expression maps with VST instruments and creating your own expression maps and using them to enhance MIDI and so on. I'll see you for more in the next video. Now, we've touched on this somewhat throughout the videos, but there are several ways to create dynamics in your orchestrations. At the root level, we have velocity of the actual notes you program. Generally, higher velocities are louder. We have expression MIDI CC11, which can be either drawn in or played in if you have an expression pedal. We have MIDI volume automation, and we have actual instrumentation, layering additional instruments together to get a thicker sound and using less instruments for a lighter sound, and leaving silence and space. These are all ways of enhancing the dynamics. Here's a little exercise I've done up incorporating a combination of these techniques. I'm going to play it through first, then we'll look at what's happening where. So there's a wide range of dynamics going on here, and I'm incorporating several of these techniques to achieve it. Now, I have the first violins doing a tremolo. We haven't used this articulation much in the series, but I'm having it do a tremolo part, and I've got expression drawn in. So let's just listen to this. So this is ramping up. And because everything else is fairly quiet at the beginning, this is actually kind of the lead underneath all the accompaniments as it ebbs in and out. And I'm doubling that on flute, where I've just copied the part across and I have the same expression and it's doing a trill. So that's using expression. Now, on the second violins, I've got a part that's got fairly steady eighth notes, but with very dramatic velocity-based accents. Playing a spiccato sound. And I'm doubling that with the clarinets. But the clarinet is only playing the accent. So I'm layering just the accents, and that's bringing them out. So those violin notes that aren't accented are kind of like ghost notes. Now I have a contrasting accent pattern happening here on the violas. And that's being doubled on the trumpets. But again, the trumpets are only playing the accented notes. Like that. Whereas this has all the eighth notes, but only some notes are accented. And let's listen to those together so you'll hear the kind of contrasting rhythms that are generated from those accents. So here I'm delicately using layering of instruments in conjunction with velocity and some panning. So it's kind of a complex little part with a lot of little intricate interplay, just due, as I say, to selective doubling and velocity-based accents. Now I've got the cello and bass here where I'm using volume automation. And here I'm just ramping them up slowly. They're playing a quarter note pulse and they start really quietly. And none of this is quantized, of course. So this kind of swells up over this amount of time where the expression on the flutes, you can see it here, and the lead violin is sort of going up and down to poke out while this is gradually all ramping up. And then finally, I've got some snare drum and I've got expression here, but in this case, I'm drawing it in rather than playing it with my pedal. And it's just a straight ramp up so it gets louder. And then I have, of course, the bass drum accenting. And then at the end here for these chords, we haven't talked about this, an orchestral tutti. And a tutti is when the whole orchestra is playing together, and that's distinguished or separate from a soloist. So I'm alternating between a tutti with these triadic chords all spelt out on these different instruments. I'm not using the full orchestra, but many instruments, each playing one note. And then the solo piccolo. So a real contrast in layering and texture. And these are playing forte, nice and loud. And we have the dainty little piccolo in the middle and then one loud tutti at the end again. So let's listen one more time and listen for how these different techniques create different forms of dynamics. I'll see you for more in the next video. In this, our last video, I want to go over some considerations and approaches as you're working on your orchestrations. Some of these we've covered before, so this is somewhat of a review, but different things to think about as you're working. Now, blend and balance with orchestral instruments is really important. Families of instruments like strings or brass blend well together. So multiple string parts, multiple brass parts will blend well together. If you want to have less of a blend, use a variety of instrumentation. Like, for example, a quartet where you have a trumpet, clarinet, viola, and bassoon. That'll be a lot more distinctive than 4 strings or 4 brass. And when you're doing that, don't be shy to use individual instruments in your samples rather than the ensemble versions when it's necessary. Avoid masking the melody. It's easy to do this unintentionally when the melody is not on the top of the underlying voicing that's being used. It's masked by other instruments. So some solutions are spread the voicing to give the melody more space. Make sure the instruments playing the melody have a different timbre tonal quality to the accompaniment, and double the melody with other instruments for more weight. Think in terms of timbre and contrast. So as you're developing your orchestration, changes of timbre should happen in logical and musical contexts, like between phrases or between sections, within a phrase if it's at a relevant point in the phrase, when there's motivic changes or climaxes or cadences, and the rate at which you add or remove timbres can create tension or relaxation. Now, we have mild contrast between timbres, and that's when you move from a lower register to a higher register. Change between adjacent members of the string family, for example, you go from violin to viola to cello, or change between related brass section instruments, like from trumpet to trombone. These are all mild types of contrast. For a greater degree of contrast, try changing instruments within the same family, like going from oboe to English horn or to clarinet. And don't be shy to use the extreme registers in the instrument range. They'll really stand out, but with the caveat that extreme registers shouldn't be used constantly, otherwise they lose their effect. And try changing instruments between sections, like moving from bassoon to French horn or to piccolo. And for a really strong contrast, change between instruments that don't blend well together. Change to different articulations, playing styles like legato to pizzicato or staccato or spiccato, for example, and add percussion to double or add to the rhythms. When you're working with soloists, they can be brought to the foreground by contrasting things like timbre, register, or rhythm in the accompaniments. And the accompaniments can be made to feel lighter by using pluck or pizzicato, staccato type strings. Don't be shy to use lots of rests in the accompaniment to allow more space for the soloist to stand out. And when you're using long notes in the accompaniment, limit them to dull or weak registers so that they don't stand out too much if you're doing sustained chords and the voicings underneath. And the soloist and orchestra can alternate roles, have each accompany the other at different points. All interesting ways of introducing contrast when you're working with a soloist. Some general considerations. Think about heterophony, which is commonly used to create melodic variation. And what that means is, we've looked at this, when one instrument or more play the primary melody, while another outlines that same melodic line by playing only notes which accents the melodic curve. And I did that in the last video with the dynamics, when I had the clarinets just playing accented notes of one of the string parts and so on. Now, a join is a technique that occurs when an instrument is playing a line and then it's joined by another timbre while it's in the middle of a phrase. So it's a nice way of adding to the texture. A dropout is the opposite, where several instruments are playing a given part and one or more take rests, bringing variation to the texture. And a variation of this is the split, which happens when 2 instruments are playing the same part and then one splits off and begins playing another part against the first instrument. And we looked at this in one of the earlier videos. And then we have a merge, which is the opposite of a split, where 2 timbres are playing 2 different parts and then merge together to give more weight to one of them. And think in terms of the contour of your lines. When your lines are rising, like with the human voice, they're associated with increasing stress and tension. So it's a nice technique to add tension to your orchestrations by using rising lines where possible. And let's review some of the things we've looked at regarding harmony and melody. We can add harmonic interest by making our harmonies more complex, or we can simplify them by making them simpler, and both are useful techniques. And think in terms of wide voicing versus close voicing as you're orchestrating your parts. And don't forget to use or add cadences where necessary, and this will give a sense of completion to sections or phrases. And we haven't talked a lot about cadences. Check out the Music Theory Explained series here on Groove 3 to learn more about the different types of cadences. We have some that have more degrees of resolution and some that leave things more open-ended. And related to this also, don't forget about inversions when you're voicing your chords, having the 3rd in the bass or the 5th in the bass. Those have very different feelings to them in the overall context and flow of the harmony. And they influence voice leading, and they also influence the degree to which cadences are perfect versus imperfect versus plagal, different types. that have, again, different degrees of closure. Now, unresolved harmony and otherwise incomplete phrases. So if the harmony creates expectations which are not immediately fulfilled, closure is avoided, and incomplete gestures create suspense. So depending on the type of cadence you might want to use, like rather than ending on the 1 chord, you can end on the 5 chord for an incomplete cadence, or instead of going 5-1, you can go flat 7-1. These all have different sort of emotional effects on the feeling of the orchestration. Now, we can add melodic interest by embellishing the melodies with neighboring tones. We've looked at this, and we can fill the spaces in with counter melodies. And we looked at this throughout the videos as well. And when it comes to counter melodies, we need to be cognizant of the motion within the parts. We have contrary motion where they move in opposite directions, similar or parallel motion, and you want to avoid parallel fifths and fourths if you can between multiple parts. We have oblique motion where one part moves and another is stationary. And we have ostinatos where you have a repeated rhythmic pattern as a counterpoint to a moving melody. So keep in mind the top line normally attracts the most attention, and consider when you're using movement. So when you're moving, when you have a static part and then it breaks off and there's movement, that's interesting. It'll draw the listener in. But if you have too much activity or movement or counterpoint, it can be distracting. And more thoughts on movement in general. Always think about voice leading. So remember, avoid parallel octaves and fifths and fourths unless you're trying for a special effect. But look at the individual instrument parts and make sure that they don't have awkward jumps. And that'll make things sound more natural and smooth. And don't forget, again, some general tips here and pointers. Enhance your orchestrations with transitions between sections. Use key changes, modulations, and meter and tempo changes. Don't copy and paste the golden rule right up there with don't quantize. And also, don't forget about using subtle tempo variations where they apply, like subtle retardandos where you slow down at the end of a cadence, or maybe you speed up at the end to just sort of change the pace up subtly. I showed you that in one of the previous videos, but very important not to keep things at one static tempo. And in addition to tempo, don't forget about dynamics. The most natural way to do it is to orchestrate your dynamics by adding additional instruments for accents. Change the playing technique or articulation, all ways of changing the dynamics. Maybe use staccato sounds or double stops. Those have more of an impact and an accent type of effect. Use crescendos and diminuendos, and you can do this. Usually your instrument libraries will have samples that have crescendos and diminuendos built into them, but if not, use MIDI control if necessary. And have the texture get thicker or thinner where necessary. And reserve some orchestral textures for big climaxes. Now let's look at some general MIDI best practices. Consider the function of overlapping sustained notes and how your software instruments respond to the overlaps. So if you have legato transitions, make sure to have some overlaps between your sustained tones versus having no overlaps so you get a clean attack on the new notes. Again, neither is right or wrong, but keep these in mind when you're programming your parts. Consider the duration of your program notes and their release times. So when you're having multiple different instruments playing, either different chords together or melodies, they might not all need to end at the exact same time because different instruments have different release times, meaning that when you stop playing the note, how long it takes for the volume to revert to zero. So you can either adjust these in your software instruments or just be cognizant of the length of the notes and adjust them as necessary so you get the release sounding the way you want. Now, relating to attack times, some instrument libraries have slower attack times than others, particularly with strings, and again, depending on the articulations you're using. So if necessary, use MIDI delay to compensate if the sample is taking too long to ramp up to the peak transient. You can always use delay either for the region or clip or for the whole track. And also, keep in mind the velocities of the notes that you're programming and how your sample libraries respond to different velocity ranges. Despite the best efforts of sample developers, the reality is that samples don't always sound the same at the different velocity ranges. So I know for myself, I have some libraries that I like the sound of certain instruments within, let's say, a range of 40 to 63. And then after 64, the sample changes and that sample has a little bit of a different timbre to it. And I want to make sure my velocities are within a certain range so they're triggering certain samples. That's on sort of less well-developed libraries and hopefully are more a thing of the past, but you may encounter that. Don't quantize your performances. And if you're using any kind of step input, use some kind of randomization in your DAW to randomize the note on position, the length, and the velocity within a narrow range. And don't forget about using MIDI expressions CC11 to introduce dynamics within your parts. And you can do this either with a dedicated expression pedal, which I highly suggest you get if you're going to be doing some orchestral work and programming. It's worth the small investment to give you this more expressive kind of feel when you're playing in your parts. And if you don't have that, you can use another hardware controller like a knob or a slider on your keyboard, or draw it in as automation. And create ensembles by using multiple individual instruments, like, for example, 3 separate trumpets or 4 separate trumpets instead of one trumpet ensemble section. And that gives you more flexibility. You can add slight timing offsets to both the tuning or the timing of the different individual instruments and even the panning. So this is Eli Krantzberg signing out. I hope you've enjoyed this series and gotten some ideas on how you can develop and improve your orchestrations. And don't forget, I'm going to have the MIDI files associated with each of the videos available for you to download if you want to look at any of the examples. So enjoy, have fun, and I'll see you for more next time.